So welcome to this evening's Bedtime Stories. I just wanted to start by reading out a quote that I saw in an Extinction Rebellion posted this morning, which says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And it really kind of resonated with me because I think when lockdown started to happen at the very beginning, we all felt there was this amazing time of change was possible. We went out, even I live in London, you could hear the birds and you could hear the wind in the trees, and it was quite a magical moment for us all to reset what we thought is possible within our lifetimes for change. And I suppose that this moment is full of potential, isn't it? There's a Build Back Better initiative which is bringing together ideas of climate justice, social justice and equality. The COVID-19 has exposed the failings of government at the very top compared to the amazing response to the needs of our communities by mutual aid groups and neighbours and friends who've supported people at the very bottom. So I think it's really thrown on its head what we think is valuable in our societies today. And also the protests about the murder of George Floyd and the many hundreds who were killed before him. All these movements and protests, we hope, will add up to something which will bring real change. I did a bedtime story a few weeks ago and forgot to record myself because I'm so rubbish at technology. But I read from this book, and I know it's back to front, but it's from Rob Hopkins, who's the founder of Transition Towns, and it's called From What Is to What If. And it documents the amazing alternative models of governance, of living, of how to run our lives from around the world. And it very much relates, so I'm going to re-record it and put it up on the Architecture Foundation YouTube channel at some point, but it really relates to the reading I'm doing tonight, which is from one of my all-time heroes, the Gentle Anarchist, as he was called, Colin. Once again backwards, but he wrote loads of books from the 60s onwards, really. He was an educator, activist, gentle anarchist, who offered us a glimpse of an alternative world that we haven't really taken advantage of his thinking, but I think now his words are even more prescient than maybe they were when he wrote them. And this is from his wonderful book, Anarchy in Action. So I will begin. How would you feel if you discovered that the society in which you would really like to live is already here, apart from a few little local difficulties like exploitation, war, dictatorship, and starvation? The argument of this book is that the anarchist society, a society which organises itself without authority, is always in existence, like a seed beneath the snow, buried under the weight of the state and its bureaucracy, under capitalism and its waste, privilege and its injustices, nationalism and its suicidal loyalties, religious differences and their superstitious separatism. Of the many possible interpretations of anarchism, the one represented here suggests that far from being a speculative vision of a future society, it is a description of a mode of human organisation rooted in the experience of the everyday, which operates side by side with and in spite of the dominant authoritarian trends of our society. This is not a new version of anarchism. Gustav Lander saw it not as the founding of something new, but as the actualisation and reconstitution of something that has always been present, which exists alongside the state, albeit buried and laid waste. And a modern anarchist, Paul Goodman, declared that a free society cannot be the substitution of a new order for the old order. It is an extension of spheres of free action until they make up most of social life. You may think that describing anarchy as organisation, I'm being deliberately paradoxical. Anarchy you may consider to be by definition the opposite of organisation, but the word really means something quite different. It means the absence of government and the absence of authority. It is, after all, governments which make and enforce laws that enable the haves to retain control of social assets to the exclusion of the have-nots. It is, after all, the principle of authority that ensures that people will work for someone else for the greater part of their lives, not because they enjoy it or have any control over their work, but because to do so is their only means of livelihood. It is, after all, governments which prepare for and wage war, even though you are obliged to suffer the consequences of their going to war. But is it only governments? The power of a government, even the most absolute dictatorship, depends on the agreement of the governed. Why do people consent to be ruled? It isn't only fear. What have millions of people to fear from a small group of professional politicians and their paid strong-arm men? It is because they subscribe to the same values as their governors. Rulers and ruled alike believe in the principle of authority, of hierarchy and of power. They even feel themselves privileged when, as happens in a small part of the globe, they can choose between alternative labels on the ruling elites. And yet in their ordinary lives they keep society going by voluntary association and mutual aid. Anarchists are people who make social and political philosophy out of the natural and spontaneous tendency of humans to associate together for mutual benefit. Anarchism is in fact the name given to the idea that it is possible and desirable for a society to organise itself without government. The word comes from the Greek, meaning without authority, and ever since the time of the Greeks there have been advocates of anarchy under one name or another. The first person in modern times to evolve a systematic theory of anarchism was William Godwin, soon after the French Revolution. The Frenchman Proudhon in the mid-19th century developed an anarchist theory of social organisation, of small units federated together but with no central power. And he was followed by the Russian revolutionary Michael Bakunin, a temporary adversary of Karl Marx. Marx represented one wing of the socialist government, concentrating on seizing the power of the state. Bakunin represented the other, seeking the destruction of state power. Another Russian, Peter Kropotkin, sought to give a scientific foundation to anarchist ideas by demonstrating that mutual aid, so visible today in our society, voluntary cooperation, is just as strong a tendency in human life as aggression and the urge to dominate. These famous names of anarchism recur in this book simply because what they wrote speaks, as the Quakers say, to our condition. But there are thousands of other obscure revolutionaries, propagandists and teachers who never wrote books for me to quote, but who have tried to spread the idea of society without government in almost every country in the world, and especially in the revolutions in Mexico, Russia and Spain. Everywhere they were defeated, and the historians wrote, anarchism finally died when Franco's troops entered Barcelona in 1939. But in Paris in 1968, anarchist flags flew over the Sorbonne, and in the same year they were seen in Brussels, Rome, Mexico City, New York, and even in Canterbury. All of a sudden, people were talking about the need for a kind of politics in which ordinary men, women, children decide their own fate and make their own future, about the need for social and political decentralisation, about workers' control of industry, about people power in school, about community control of social services. Anarchism, instead of being a romantic historical byway, becomes an attitude to organisation which is ever more relevant today than it has seemed in the past. History, said W.R. Letheby, is written by those who survive, philosophy by the well-to-do, those who go under have the experience. But once you begin to look at human society from an anarchist point of view, you discover that the alternatives are already there, in the interstices of the dominant power structure. If you want to build a free society, the parts are all in hand. So in the rest of the book, Colin outlines examples of these anarchist modes within housing, within planning, within education. So please read it. But I'm going to jump to the end now. The The chapter before the one I'm going to read is called How Deviant Dare You Get, which is a provocation to you all to think about what you want to do and what your agency is out in the world. So, back to Letherby, from Form in Civilization. For the earlier part of my life, I was quieted by being told that ours was the richest nation in the world, until I woke up to know that what I meant by riches was learning and beauty, and music and art, and coffee and omelettes. Perhaps in the coming days of poverty, we may get more of these. Colin writes, this book has illustrated the arguments for anarchism, not from theories, but from actual examples of tendencies in which exist alongside the much more powerful and dominant authoritarian methods of social organisation. The important question is, therefore, not whether anarchy is possible or not, but whether we can so enlarge the scope and influence of libertarian methods that they become the normal way in which human beings organise their society. Is an anarchist society possible? We can only say from the evidence of human history that no kind of society is impossible. If you are powerful enough and ruthless enough, you can impose almost any kind of social organisation on people for a while. But you can only do so by methods which, however natural and appropriate they may be for any other kind of ism, acting on the well-known principle that you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, these are repugnant to anarchists, unless they see themselves as yet another of these revolutionary elites leading the people to the promised land. You can impose authority, but you cannot impose freedom. An anarchist society is improbable, not because anarchy is unfeasible or unfashionable or unpopular, but because human society is not like that. Because, as Malatesta put in the passage quoted in the last chapter, we are, in any case, only one of the forces acting in society. So, what are the prospects for increasing the anarchist content of the real world? From one point of view, the outlook is bleak. Centralised power, whether that of government or super-government, or of private capitalism or the super-capitalism of the giant international corporations, have never been greater. The prophecies of the 19th century anarchists like Proudhon and Bakunin have about the power of the state over the citizen have a relevance today which must have seemed unlikely for their contemporaries. From another standpoint, the outlook is infinitely promising. The very growth of the state and its bureaucracy, the giant corporation and its privileged hierarchy, are exposing their vulnerability to non-cooperation, to sabotage, and to the exploitation of their weaknesses by the weak. They are giving rise to parallel organisations, counter-organisations and alternative organisations which exemplify the anarchist method. Industrial mergers and rationalisation have bred the revival of the demand for workers' control, first as a slogan or a tactic like the work-in and ultimately as a destination. The development of the school and the university as broiler houses for a place in the occupational pecking order have given rise to the deschooling movement and the idea of the anti-university. The use of medicine and psychiatry as agents of conformity has led to the idea of the anti-hospital and of the self-help therapeutic group. The failure of Western society to house its citizens has prompted the growth of squatter movements and tenants' cooperatives. The triumph of the supermarket in the United States has begun a mushrooming of food cooperatives. The deliberate pauperisation of those who cannot work has led to the recovery of self-respect through claimants' unions. Just so you know, this book was first written in the 70s and then republished in the 80s and then again in 2008. Community organisations of every conceivable kind, community newspapers, movements from child welfare, communal households have resulted from the new consciousness that local as well as central governments exploit the poor and are unresponsive to those who are unable to exert effective pressure for themselves. The rationalisation of local administration in Britain into larger and more effective units is evoking a response in the demand for neighbourhood councils. A new confidence and assertion of their right to exist on their own terms has sprung. Hope I'm back, everyone. Sorry, my internet went down quickly. So, a new self-confidence and assertion of their right to exist on their own terms has sprung up among the victims of particular kinds of discrimination. Black liberation, women's liberation, homosexual liberation, prisoners' liberation, and children's liberation. The list is almost endless, and it's certainly going to get longer as more and more people become more and more conscious that society is organised in a way in which will deny them a place in the sun. In the age of mass politics and mass conformity, this is a magnificent reassertion of the individual value and of human dignity. That resonates really powerfully at the moment, of course. None of these movements is yet a threat to the power structure, and this is scarcely surprising since hardly any of them existed before the late 1960s. None of them fits into the framework of conventional politics. In fact, they don't speak the same language as political parties. They talk the language of anarchism, and they insist on anarchist principles of organisation, which they have learned not from political theory, but from their own experience. They organise in loosely associated groups, which are voluntary, functional, temporary and small. They depend not on membership cards, votes, a special leadership and a herd of inactive followers, but on a small functional groups which ebb and flow, group and regroup according to the task in hand. They are networks, not pyramids. But in thinking about a plausible future, another factor has entered into the general consciousness since the late 60s. He was writing this in the 70s, remember. So many books, so many reports, so many conferences have been devoted to it that it is only necessary for me to state a few general propositions about it. The first is that the world's resources are finite. The second is that the wealthy economies, having been exploiting the unrenewable resources at a rate which the planet cannot sustain. The third is that these developed economies are also exploiting the resources of the third world countries as cheap raw materials. This means not only that the third world countries can never hope to achieve the levels of consumption of the rich world, but that the rich countries themselves cannot continue to consume at the present accelerating rate. The growth economists, the politicians of both right and left, who envisaged the ever-expanding cycle of consumption with the philosophy characterised by Kenneth Burke as borrow, spend, buy, waste, want, have just not caught up with future realities. If anyone has, it is the minority among the young in the affluent countries who have consciously rejected the mass consumption society, its values as well as its dearly bought products, and adopted a different set of priorities, those of an earlier consumer philosophy. Eat it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. The editor of The Ecologist summed up the argument thus: affluence for everybody is an impossible dream. The world simply does not contain sufficient resources, nor could it absorb the heat and other waste generated by the immense amount of energy required. Indeed, the most important thing to realise when we plan for our future is that affluence is both a local and a temporary phenomenon. Unfortunately, it is the principal, if not the only goal, our industrial society has given us. His journal, in its blueprint for survival, has the distinction of being amongst the few commentaries on the crisis of environment and resources to go beyond predicting the consequences of continued population growth and depletion of resources, to envisaging a new kind of physical and economic structure of life in which its authors regard as indispensable for a viable future, drawing up a timetable of change for the century 1975 to 2075, to establish in that time a network of self-sufficient, self-regulating communities. The authors cheerfully accept the charge that their programme is unsophisticated and oversimplified, the implication being that if the reader can formulate a better alternative or a different timescale, then they should do so. The interesting thing is that they have reinvented an older version of the future, because back in the 1890s, three men, equally unqualified as shareholders in Utopia Limited, formulated their prescriptions for the physical setting of a future society. William Morris, designer and a socialist, wrote News from Nowhere. Peter Kropotkin, geographer and anarchist, wrote Fields, Factories and Workshops. And Ebenezer Howard, inventor and parliamentary shorthand writer, wrote Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Reform. Each of these blueprints for survival was more influential than its original readers could have proposed, but although less than its authors would have hoped. Morris's vision was totally irrelevant for the 20th century, but his picture of a post-industrial, decentralised, state-free Britain in the 21st century certainly makes sense for the new technologically aware generation, while any American will recognise the force of his backward glance at the future of the United States. This is William Morris writing from the 1890s. For these lands, and I say especially the northern parts of America, suffered so terribly from the full force of the last days of civilization and became such horrible places to live in that one may say that for nearly 100 years the people of the northern parts of America have been engaged in gradually making a dwelling place out of a stinking dust heap. Well done, William! Howard's legacy is, of course, the new towns. His immediate purpose was to mobilise voluntary initiative for the building of one demonstration model, confident that its advantages would set in motion a large-scale adaptation of the idea of urban dispersal into social cities, or what the TCPA calls a many-centred nexus of urban communities. Lewis Mumford notes that, by now, our neotechnic and biotechnical facilities have at last caught up with Howard and Kropotkin's intuitions. Howard's plan for canalising the flow of population, diverting it from the existing centres to new centres, his plan for decentralising industry and setting up both city and industry within the rural matrix, the whole plan to a human scale, is technologically far more feasible today than it was. Kropotkin's own vision of the future, with industry decentralised and the competition for markets replaced by local production and consumption, while people themselves alternate brain work and manual work, is being realised in a political climate we hardly foresaw in China, but is equally in harmony with the programme of the Blueprint for Survival. The scattering of industries over the country, so as to bring the factory amidst the fields, to make agriculture derive all these profits, which it always finds in being combined with industry, and to produce the combination of industrial with agricultural work, is surely the next step to be taken. This step is imposed by the necessity for each healthy man and woman to spend part of their lives in manual work in the free air, and it will be rendered more necessary when the great social movements, which have now become unavoidable, come to disturb the present international trade and compel each nation to revert to its own resources for her own maintenance. So, as Colin writes, will it ever happen? Will this humane and essentially anarchistic vision of the workable future simply join in all the other anarchical utopias of the past? Years ago, George Orwell remarked, "If one considers the probability, one is driven to the conclusion that anarchism implies a low standard of living. It need not imply a hungry or an uncomfortable world, but it rules out the kind of air-conditioned, chromium-plated, gadget-ridden existence which is now considered desirable and enlightened. The processes involved in making, say, an aeroplane are so complex as to be only possible in a planned, centralised society, with all the repressive apparatus that implies. Unless there is some unpredictable change in human nature, liberty and efficiency must pull in opposite directions." This, from Orwell's point of view, and he was not a lover of luxury, is not itself a criticism of anarchism, and he is certainly right in thinking that an anarchist society would never build Concord or land a man on the moon. But were either of these technological triumphs efficient in terms of resources poured into them and the results for the ordinary inhabitant of the planet? Size and resources are to the technologist what power is to the politician. He can never have too much of them. A different kind of society, with different priorities, would involve a different technology. Its bases already exist, and in terms of the tasks to be performed, it would be far more efficient than either Western capitalism or Soviet state capitalism. Nearly finished. But it is not in the least likely that states and governments, in either the rich or the poor world's will, of their own volition, embark on the drastic change of direction which consideration of our probable future demands. Necessity may reduce the rate of resource consumption, but the powerful and the privileged will hang on to their share, both within nations and between nations. Power and privilege have never been known to abdicate. This is why anarchism is bound to be a call to revolution. But what kind of revolution? Nothing has been said in this book about the two great irrelevances of the discussion about anarchism: the false antithesis between violence and non-violence, and between revolution and reform. The most violent institutions in our society is the state, and it reacts violently to efforts to take away its power. As Malatesta used to say, you try to do your thing and they intervene, and then you are to blame for the fight that then happens. Does this mean that the effort should not be made? A distinction has to be made between the violence of the oppressor and the resistance of the oppressed. Similarly, there is a distinction not between revolution and reform, but on the one hand between the kind of revolution which installs a different gang of rulers, or the kind of reform which makes oppression more palatable or more efficient, and on the other, those social changes, whether revolutionary or reformist, through which people enlarge their autonomy and reduce their subjugation to external authority. Colin ends. Anarchism in all its guises is an assertion of human dignity and responsibility. It is not a programme for political change, but an act of social self-determination. So, that was Colin. But if you can bear to be with me for 2 more minutes, I just want to build us up to date with a very short reading from the Tribune, which is a socialist left-wing magazine. We've got to reclaim socialism. It's become a dirty word in this country. Anyway, so this is from the latest edition, and it's in the editorial written by Ronan Burton Shaw. He starts, workers keep society going. After the crisis, they should run it too. Day by day, in actions small and large, labour provides the collective basis that makes society possible. It stitches together the social fabric, only for capital to tear it apart. Every day across Britain, what we now describe as key workers set out to maintain life. They do this not only in care homes and hospitals, they do it in supermarkets, stacking shelves and in food production. They do it in cleaning our streets and collecting our bins. They do it by delivering mail and keeping essential public transport operational. Each day, workers like these lay the foundations of a decent society, based on common endeavour for the common good, only to see their efforts sabotaged before their shift ends. They are torn down by the fecklessness of a Tory government which refused to take the pandemic seriously, delayed lockdown, allowed non-essential work to continue, then failed to provide adequate PPE, tracing or testing. A government which had time to learn lessons from Italy and Spain, but instead allowed Britain to surpass them to the worst death toll in Europe. A government which now flirts with further disaster by lifting the lockdown before it ensures safety. They are torn down by the pompous and also the profiteers. But the dominant creed for more than a generation has been to venerate capital. We have been told that the real value in our society is created not by the nurses, the cleaners and the bin collectors, but by the stockbrokers and the bankers and the billionaires. All economic policies must be designed as a spur to wealth creators, Margaret Thatcher told the House of Commons in 1985 in a speech opposing the minimum wage. As if the vast corporate empires of our age had not been built on the backs of minimum wage work. As if the wealth was the product only of the genius of the capitalist. And this has done untold damage. But this crisis of COVID-19 has reacquainted us with the truth. An army of mostly low-paid workers carry out the tasks which keep our society running. Capital reaps the rewards of their endeavours, and increasingly it refuses to allow them even a share in its riches, choosing executive bonuses and shareholder dividends instead of wage increases, and offshore bank accounts instead of paying taxes. Capital does not respect the work needed to build a society. The only work it values is that which produces profit. This is why our system is so corrosive to the very collectives of family, community and society which have sustained us through this crisis. Capital values the care we give to our vulnerable neighbours so long as we're providing a service for a price. It says the hungry can be fed and the homeless housed, but only if they can pay for it. And increasingly, it says that the healthcare can be provided to those in need once private companies have made a buck along the way. But a new consensus can emerge from this moment of crisis, as it has from crises past. We can say that the days of capital tearing down the society labour bills are over. We can demand that the conscientiousness displayed by workers is rewarded by a place at the heart of post-crisis Britain. Except this time the workers won't only lay the foundations, they'll build the entire structure, a society in which the decisions which shape our lives are made for and by working people. This is the socialist ideal.